to this month's National Equine Health Call. Thanks for joining today. Again, I thank everyone who has provided us topics or suggested speakers for participation in this call. And I welcome further suggestions. I am working on next month's agenda. Next month's call will be March 13th. Same time, same new link for this year. And just a reminder, I will put everyone on mute as we start the call. And this call is being recorded. This recording will be placed next week on the Equine Disease Communication Center for folks to join in and listen to the call after today's recording is posted. So again, thank you for everybody joining today. And our topic today, we're going to start with screwworm. And to give us a background, we're going to have Dr. Nellie Amador-Jen from the Florida Department of State Veterinarian, and she's going to give us a background on screwworm. Dr. Nellie, go take it away. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go right ahead.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on, Dr. Flynn. I'm excited to talk about this, and I'm going to just jump right in because I have a lot to cover. All right, so New World screwworm is Cochleomya omnivorox, and omnivorox actually means man-eater. It is one of the few known insects that feeds on living tissue, mainly warm-blooded animals, although it can rarely infect some birds as well as some reptile. It's definitely not the preferred species, really likes the warm-blooded animals. The female can deposit eggs in tiny, tiny wounds, but it also really likes mucous membranes, and that's what we were seeing a lot of in the cases when we had the Florida Keys outbreak. So why is screwworm important? It really comes down to cost and health. A screwworm outbreak on the mainland US could easily get over $1 billion to eradicate. Our smaller scale outbreak that we had in 2016-17 was over $3 million, and it was a relatively contained outbreak since it didn't get onto the Florida mainland. It was contained to the Florida Keys, except for one case that did get up into the mainland. This map is really fascinating to me. So back in the 60s to the 80s, all of southern US used to be endemic with New World screwworm. The campaign really began to eradicate it, and as of 1959, Florida had eradicated screwworm and kind of over towards the west. And then really over the next 4 decades, we were able to get it back down to Panama. And the southern point of Panama is what has maintained the barrier over the last several decades. So everything south of Panama used to be positive. Everything north of Panama was negative. Now, starting approximately 2 years ago, Panama started having outbreaks locally. They did increase fly production at the time, but pretty soon, Costa Rica had some cases reported, then Nicaragua had some cases reported, then Honduras had cases reported, and now it's gone all the way up to the southern point of Mexico, which I think is when news really started coming out about this and has been getting a lot more attention since it got to Mexico. What's really interesting, though, is if you look over the past several decades, we have had multiple detections. On average, we get approximately 1 a year. Many are found at the import stations. And I do have a graph in the next slide, but Argentina seems to be one of the countries that does import quite a few, and horses and dogs are the main species that get infected. Although last year the US did have 3 human cases, all related to international travel. So I did find this graph from Iowa. It only goes up to 2012, but as you can see, horses was the species that most likely was found with screwworm, followed by dogs. And here's a couple of the different countries that they came from. Just an overview of the life cycle. The adult flies, after emerging from their pupa, are ready to mate within 1 to 3 days. After they mate, the female fly will look for a wound or a mucous membrane. She's also able to create wounds, but if there's a wound already present or something like the navel of a newborn calf, those are really areas that she'll lay her eggs in. She can lay hundreds of eggs at a time, and normally she lays them in batches, 4 to 6 batches. And then those eggs will turn into 3 different stages of larvae. So L1, L2, and L3. Once it gets to the 3rd larval stage, and this process takes about a week. Once it gets to the 3rd larval stage, that 3rd stage larva will fall off into the ground and bury and pupate about a week later. Now, the pupal stage is the most variable stage and the one that we can control the most via temperature changes. So when we were having flights flown from Panama to the Keys, as long as they're refrigerated at certain temperatures, a pupa can actually go into almost a hibernation stage between 1 and 2 months. But once the temperatures start getting warmer, then that fly will start ecdicing or hatching out. With transmission, the big difference with screwworm is that it has to feed on living tissue. So as the eggs hatch larvae, those larvae are going to burrow down deep until they get living tissue. And as the tissue around it starts dying off, other flies will come in and opportunistically lay their eggs. So it's really important when you're collecting maggots that you get it from deeper down in the tissue. Many of the samples collected, it wasn't unusual to see 3 to 5 different species of flies laying their eggs all in the same wound. So in the small animals, giving them a capstar, waiting a few minutes, and then collecting samples was really helpful, because then those deeper down larvae would just start falling off. Morbidity and mortality can really vary. If an animal becomes systemically ill, then obviously the septicemia can be what kills it. But in the early stages, it is a very treatable disease. So I mentioned capstar with the small animals. The ivermectin family for longer term treatment is also effective. We were using doramectin instead of ivermectin, but that worked really well for the key deer. But if left untreated, then it will kill an animal within about a week. Clinical signs, I mean, the biggest sign are these horrific wounds. These are not normal wounds, and the quantity of maggots is usually in the hundreds. So it's not going to be your single botfly type lesion. These are going to be extensive, severe lesions with very foul odors. And obviously the animal will be affected, can become lethargic, depressed, go off feed, things like that. With our outbreak, in hindsight, it appears that the index case was actually around the beginning of July. However, it was not reported to us until the end of September. So as you can imagine, with those 3 months, we mentioned that the life cycle is approximately 3 weeks. So that's about 4 life cycles at least that we were already behind in, and we were notified. Now, at the time, the males were in rut. So, just with fighting, they were getting lots of head lesions, and a lot of the lesions that we were seeing were centered around their horns. But also, it hadn't been seen in, about 6 decades at the time. So I think that those were some of the reasons that caused the slower reporting. But now that it's on everybody's radar, we definitely expect them to report really quickly. The silver lining for us was that it was pretty isolated to the Keys, and we had this natural barrier of the 7 Mile bridge. The flies don't like to fly long distances if they have a food source available locally. So this really helped us to maintain the flies. And instead of doing aerial releases, what is done in Central America, we were doing ground chamber releases. This map on the bottom here, if you see the proximity of the Florida Keys to Cuba and even, Dominican, Haiti, all of these countries here that we know are positive for screwworm, this is a constant source for us to be vigilant about, because we do get lots of travel internationally to, especially to South Florida. Looking at the dates here, this is when we were notified of the case. However, looking back, there were multiple reported cases in the previous 3 months of severe cases of maggot infestation. What's really impressive to me is the time frame from the time that we were notified till the time that we started our sterile insect release. It was less than 2 weeks, which, considering the fact that we had to fly them up from Panama and the numerous agencies that were involved, I think that was actually a pretty fast turnaround time. Another 2 weeks later, we started doing the treatment. I mentioned with the treatment, we were doing doramectin. We actually were injecting doramectin into donuts or sweetbread and then feeding it to the key deer. But remember that the key deer are an endangered species. So there were some hoops to go through, because endangered species are not supposed to be hand fed. You're supposed to have minimal contact with them. So just getting all of the approvals to have that happen took a little bit of time. But once we started both of these things, you can see that very quickly the cases started dropping. So just to give you an idea, I mean, you can run through the list, but like I mentioned, multiple agencies were involved in this unified command that we had in the Keys. Again, the wounds are not just your typical normal wounds. These are going to be very dramatic, severe wounds. The males were in rut, so a lot of the wounds that we were seeing were centered around their horns. And I mean, you can see how deep the maggots go into here. They get their name screwworm. If you see them, the body and the shape is kind of screw shaped, and they'll dig their feeding parts down deep into the living tissues, and their breathing apparatus or their spiracles are towards their butt end, so they can stick that out and still breathe while they feed down in the deeper tissues. This is one of the dogs that we're seeing in the Keys during this time. And once some of this tissue was debrided, it was just hundreds of maggots under here. But this dog actually did really well with treatment. This was one of the stray cats that did not do so well. This cat was actually still alive when it was brought in, but it had such severe maggot infestation within its ear canal and around its anus that it was euthanized. So reasons to do fly surveillance: in the initial stages, you need to get an idea of the density of wildflies, because that's what's going to dictate approximately how many sterile flies need to be released. So the ideal ratio is about a 10-to-1 ratio of sterile flies to wild type flies. Then after, you really want to see the distribution and how far, and if there's any areas that are not getting sterile flies. So that's another reason to continue doing the surveillance. The gold standard of surveillance is currently what Dr. John Walsh up here is doing, and it's sitting with a net in front of a plate of rotten liver for 1 hour at a time and looking for a fly that you think could possibly be a screwworm fly, wait for that fly to land on this plate, and then drop your net down. And that's the easy part. The hard part then becomes, out of this net full of 100 flies, trying to find the one single fly that you thought could possibly be a screwworm fly, grab it in your hands and put it into a container to be able to send it off for further testing. So it is definitely something that has to be practiced for a while, which is after this response, Dr. Bolton actually came up with a design for a trap, which is a lot more user-friendly and requires minimal training. And I'll talk a little bit about the trap in a few slides. Sterile insect technique in general is really fascinating. There were two entomologists that really led this charge, Edward Nippling and Raymond Bushland. They came up and figured out that the female screwworm fly only mates once in her life, which is really the basis of what allows this to work. So when enough sterile males are released into the environment, statistically speaking, once she mates with a sterile male, then she no longer is going to produce eggs. And that's why it takes multiple life cycles for the population of wild flies to decline. And I keep talking about sterile males, but in actuality, we release both sterile males and females, which means that approximately half of the flies that we release don't really help us in our eradication efforts. They have been trying different experiments to create a larger percentage of males over females, and they've found that adding tetracycline at a particular point in the rearing process will give them a higher percentage of males. But that is definitely something that needs to be looked into further, because it could very quickly double our amount of sterile males that we're releasing without changing anything on the production side. So this is what one of the release chambers were, the chambers that were actually brought up from the Panamanians during our outbreak. But basically, these are the pupa, and we would fill them within these trays. And then as the weather warmed up, the flies would start ecdicing and emerge as adult flies, and they could crawl out of these small little holes. We had to cover this because raccoons, we found, love eating these very, very expensive pupa. So these covers were created to try and deter other animals from getting to the pupa. So this is just a map of where we were doing releases. And we did have one single dog case that was found over in the Homestead area, and that's why you'll see these releases were also done there. But luckily, it was just that one single case. All of the other cases were in mainly key deer found in this general area. Feral swine is also a big consideration for Florida, and I'm sure in a couple of other states as well. Feral swine have been found to be really common host and can act as a reservoir, and they like to swim. So they can transfer flies. So if we ever got it on the mainland, that would definitely be a consideration that we have to take into account. I talked about the new trap that was made that will hopefully be in conjunction with doing the liver surveillance. But this trap is something that can be easily hung in a suitable habitat, and we do a lot of aerial viewing for suitable habitats. We also take into account things like humidity and wind direction and proximity to water, just trying to find the best habitats that we think flies could be in. And then we'll hang this trap out for an hour and do it as a rotation so that by the time we hang 5 traps, we're ready to go pick up the first one. And doing this way, doing this method, we found that we can collect and surveil a lot more points.
This is about set for start time.
So you can see how the trap works. We still use the liver bait. We just put the liver in the bottom portion of this trap. And you can see there's a lot of blowflies that very, very quickly find the scent and go in. Afterward, we go back and we'll euthanize the flies and pick out the ones that we feel are suspect flies and then can send those off. I think I had another video in here. They're also a lot more discreet, so we can go into an area, even if it's a little more populated, like we do parks quite a bit, trap versus having someone just sitting there with rotten liver. You get a lot more questions asked with the second method. In addition to our 2016 outbreak, we also last year had one of the US human cases. It was a gentleman that had flown back from a positive country, and he did have third instar larva when he came back. He came from the airport and went directly to the hospital. However, during that time, he was blowing his nose and larvae were visibly coming out, and he was throwing away those tissues in the trash. So because of the concern of the slightest possibility that any of those larvae could have possibly pupated and ecdiced and mated, we actually did deploy over a period of 4 weeks. There were 3 general areas that we focused on. One was the area around the airport where he landed. One was around the area of the hospital that he was treated at. And the last one where we focused a lot of our efforts was around the landfill. So we asked the hospital where their waste products went, since we knew he had blown his nose and the larva had gone into the trash. And then to the landfill down here, we spent a lot of time doing surveillance around these sites. And in just a matter of weeks, we were able to do about 165 sites with very few personnel. So this is the trap hanging in one of the parks that we went to. And you can see from a distance, it is pretty kind of blends in. That's why we painted it black as well to kind of blend in more. And we were picking areas that, were more likely to be suitable habitats for flies. So a lot of times that meant swampy areas where we had to go back and pick ticks off of ourselves after finishing the day's work. What the traps look like, and we had just finished these traps on a NADPREP project. So NADPREP was pretty happy that we were able to get really good use out of them. So some really important points. It's really the outreach to accredited veterinarians. Remember that a lot of these vets have never seen a case like this. So reaching out to your vets and making sure that they know that this is a reportable disease, and if they're seeing any unusual cases of myiasis, that they really need to report that. Now with the current Central American outbreak, even physicians can start seeing some affected human cases. So I know that CDC has ramped up their webinars, and in their One Health, they have been doing more outreach on the human side. But neglecting to report cases really is going to be millions, if not billions of dollars to get it eradicated from the United States. So reporting has to be one of the biggest take-home messages that we do. The other thing is how wildlife can really play a role. You know, a lot of these animals, like the feral swine, can be a reason that it lasts a lot longer and is harder to eradicate. So I did a very quick whirlwind introduction to screwworm. I'm very happy to answer any questions either now or after the next lecture.
Dr. Nelly, thank you so much for a very good comprehensive overview. What I think we'll do at this time is we'll just let USDA talk about the import requirements, and then after that presentation, we'll open it up to questions regarding screwworm in general, and whether it's you or the USDA questions. So at this time, we'll just transition to Dr. Sarah McNitt with USDA Veterinary Services import policy staff. And Dr. Nelly, if you can stop sharing, Dr. McNitt will share her screen. All right, Dr. McNitt, go ahead. Thank you for your time.
Okie dokie. If you can't see my screen or you can't hear me, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm just gonna go ahead and get started.
All is good. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I am Dr. Sarah McNitt. I'm one of the veterinary medical staff officers with Live Animal Import that is dedicated to equine imports. And I'm going to go over the Mexico New World Screwworm import requirements. This presentation there's parts of this presentation that are specific to Mexico, but overall, these requirements are applicable to horses being imported, equids being imported from countries that are APHIS recognizes as affected with New World Screwworm. Let's see. All right. So we've already had an awesome overview of New World Screwworm, so I'm not gonna get into this slide so that we can get on with the rest and we can have time for questions later. So New World Screwworm has been slowly marching north. In mid-November, APHIS was notified that Mexico had a confirmed case of New World Screwworm in a calf in the Chiapas state. I'm sorry if I murdered that, bordering Guatemala. Since the detection, APHIS has worked closely with Seneca to ensure understanding of U.S. import requirements for horses and cattle. And APHIS has negotiated to the Mexico U.S. export health certificate and 2 addendums to cover the required exams for horses entering the U.S. from a country APHIS considers affected with New World Screwworm. For the purpose of this presentation, I am using the term horses, but this is actually applicable to any equids eligible for import into the U.S. from Mexico. And so these requirements affect horses that are originating from or that have resided in Mexico within the 60 days immediately preceding export to the U.S. It also affects the horses that are transiting Mexico and are required, these guys are required to complete New World Screwworm mitigations upon arrival to an APHIS approved importing facility. And this also affects horses that have recently have resided in Mexico, but then have immediately prior to export have resided in the country APHIS recognizes as New World Screwworm free for a minimum of 7 days. These horses do not need to complete the New World's Screwworm protocol. If they have been examined by an authorized veterinarian and found to be free of New World Screwworm during this exam, and they are accompanied by an endorsed certificate of this exam when they arrive to the U.S. Please contact LAI policy at usda.gov for further information on this guidance on this allowance. So pre-export requirements. So these are mitigations that must be performed prior to entering an APHIS approved import quarantine facility. This goes for land border ports, and that refers to when, like, immediately before the horses enter the import quarantine facility. And for airports, this refers to when they are loaded onto the plane, just to give you an idea as far as the time frames that we're talking about with this. So 3 to 5 days prior, the animals have to be inspected by an authorized or approved MVRA or Senesca veterinarian. They must be visually and physically inspected for any wounds. All mucous membranes must be visually inspected. Horses with visible wounds at this stage are not eligible for export to the United States and must be removed from the shipment. Horses without visible wounds or without evidence of infestation of New World screwworm must be treated with ivermectin. Oral ivermectin formulated for horses and administered per the manufacturer directions is approved. The use of equivalent products does require pre-approval, as this is a derogation for requirements. So if you are thinking about using not an ivermectin product, please reach out to LII policy to discuss that with us at that point in time. Once the horses have been inspected and treated, the MVRA veterinarian or the Senesca veterinarian will issue a New World's Groom inspection and treatment certificate. Horses that are ineligible for export or horses that have been gelded within 14 days of the planned export, horses with visible wounds, as we previously discussed, horses with any evidence of New World screwworm. These horses must be removed from the shipment, though they may be eligible after the wound has been treated, healed, and New World screwworm has been eliminated. So pre-quarantine inspection, horses must be inspected for New World screwworm within 24 hours of entering an APHIS approved federal import quarantine. So this time frame is, again, as I previously mentioned, so immediately before that 24 hours is immediately before they enter the import quarantine facility, if they're coming through a land border port, or during that 24 hours before they get onto the plane. So I'm sorry, I'm probably making that less clear when I talk about the land border ports. So within 24 hours of entering the quarantine for the land border ports, and within 24 hours of getting on a conveyance to go to an airport to export to the US, just to make that clear for the timeframes that we're discussing. So this inspection must be performed by a Senesca veterinarian. A veterinarian can perform the inspection under the direct oversight of a Senesca veterinarian. So essentially they are helping. I think I skipped ahead. So essentially the MVR veterinarian, it would be assisting the Senesca veterinarian in doing the exam, but it really comes down to that Senesca veterinarian is the one that is performing the exam alongside the MVRA veterinarian, and they are the ones that are endorsing the certificate when the exam is done. So we are looking at, again, a visual and physical inspection for signs of New World screwworm, including examination of all mucous membranes and external edge genitalia. This includes full extension of the penis. At the time of loading into the conveyance or entering into the quarantine, again, we're talking about land and airports at this point in time, the approved MVRA or Senesca veterinarian must inspect each horse for visible wounds. All visible wounds must be treated with a solution of Coumaphos dust at a concentration of 3% active ingredient. The Senesca veterinarian will then issue a certificate of export inspection and freedom from New World screwworm. This is an addendum to the currently agreed upon veterinary health certificate for the importation of horses into the United States from Mexico. All of these documents are available on the APHIS website for importing horses into the US from Mexico. If at any time New World screwworm infestation is suspected, the affected equine is not eligible to export to the United States until it has been treated, the wounds are fully healed, and there is no evidence of New World screwworm. So I've said a couple times, approved or authorized veterinarians. So Senesca is creating a pool of trained MVRA and Senesca veterinarians that are, again, trained in performing examinations and identification of New World screwworm. Only these trained individuals will be eligible to endorse certificates, perform the exam, administer treatments for horses entering the US. And Senesca will house this list for us and make it available to APHIS. I do have a link to the site where the list is available, and it's on a Senesca site at the end of this presentation, where I have all of basically all of the resources for this. So for presentation of health documentation, This is where we get into some of the slight differences between land and border ports for horses that are entering by land. The original hard copy of the veterinary health certificate for importation of horses into the United States from Mexico must be presented 48 hours prior to the shipment entering the APHIS-approved import quarantine facility. Original hard copies of the two addendums, the New World Screwworm Inspection and Treatment Certificate and the Certificate of Export Inspection and Freedom from New World Screwworm, must be shipped with the horses and presented to APHIS upon arrival at the APHIS-approved import quarantine facility. For horses that are arriving by air, all copies, so original hard copies of the veterinary export health certificate, the inspection and treatment certificate, and the inspection and freedom of New World Screwworm must be presented with the horse upon arrival at the APHIS-approved import quarantine facility. Falsification of any part of the New World Screwworm certification will result in suspension of the approved MVRA and or approved Seneca veterinarian from any screwworm related export duties, as well as suspension of all equine exports from Mexico while Seneca investigates the incident. Resumption of the equine exports is dependent on Seneca providing APHIS written confirmation of the official veterinarian suspension, a detailed report of investigation findings, and any corrective actions that they took. When the horses are horses that are in an APHIS approved import quarantine facility, they are inspected within the first 24 hours by a veterinary medical officer for any signs of New World Screwworm investigation. This is part of the regular import process for these horses now. Any visible wounds will be retreated. Sedation is not required for this exam. Horses will be in quarantine for a minimum of 7 days, and within 24 hours prior to release, so that last 24 hours of their quarantine period, an APHIS VMO will perform a visual and physical inspection for signs of New World Screwworm, including examination of all mucous membranes and external genitalia. This does include full extension of the penis. Sedation is required for this exam for geldings and stallions and may be required for mares if the VMO is unable to perform a thorough examination in a safe manner. Okay, now we get into kind of some of the nitty gritty of what to do with what happens if New World Screwworm is found in a horse in an APHIS approved federal import quarantine facility. So as we learned, screwworm infestation is most often associated with the presence of a pre-existing wound, but may also be found in mucous membranes. Any wound should be examined for the presence of myiasis, so areas of infestation may be odorous or suppurative with bloody or purulent discharge. The APHIS VMO or authorized veterinarian on APHIS supervision must collect samples of suspected screwworm larvae and send them to NVSL for official identification. The samples are collected by gently removing larvae from several sites in depths within the open wound using forceps. Again, because as we recently learned, because secondary myiasis may be present and is most often found near the surface of the wound, it is especially important to collect specimens from the deepest part of the lesion. If possible, collect larvae of different sizes for submission. Specimens must be placed in a tightly closing vial or test tube and preserved in alcohol at room temperature. The tube is labeled with the animal's identification number and submitted to NVSL with a parasite submission form, noting the section number of the NVSL import testing submission so that we can keep everything linked. Any animal confirmed to be infested with New World Screwworm must undergo effective treatment. So all visible eggs and larvae must be removed from within and around the wounds. All wounds should then be thoroughly cleaned, debrided, disinfected, and treated with a topical medication that is effective against New World Screwworm and approved by APHIS. Depending on severity, the animal may need extensive wound care, systemic antimicrobials, and analgesia. A systemic medication with larvicidal activity demonstrated to be effective in eliminating screwworm larvae from horses and approved by APHIS must be administered. Generally, this is again ivermectin. The affected horse must be re-inspected by the APHIS VMO or authorized veterinarian under direct APHIS supervision 24 hours after administration of appropriate treatment to confirm no live larvae remain in the wound. If live larvae are found, the additional larvae should be removed as previously discussed, and continued monitoring the wound is required until no live larvae remain in the wound. Retreatment of the medications, both topical and oral, per the manufacturer's label may be necessary. The affected horse will be held in an APHIS-approved import quarantine for 7 days after the last detection of New World screwworm. So that's after the last detection, the last time you guys find, last time we find live larvae in that wound. An APHIS VMO or an authorized veterinarian under direct VS oversight will perform a new examination in the last 24 hours of this additional 7-day period. This includes a full visual and physical exam, including all mucous membranes. Equine genitalia must be thoroughly inspected, and sedation is required for stallions and geldings, and again, may be necessary for mares for a thorough and safe exam. If no New World screwworm is detected and the animal is determined by the APHIS VMO to be free of New World screwworm, the horse is eligible for release from import quarantine. Cohorts. If New World screwworm is detected in an animal in an APHIS-approved federal import quarantine facility, all animals on the premises are considered cohort. We define the premises as a tract of land or water, including all its buildings, that is maintained by a single set of personnel and services. Upon confirmation of New World screwworm in the affected equine, all cohorts must receive a systemic medication with larvicidal activity demonstrated to be effective in eliminating screwworm larvae from the affected species and approved by APHIS. Equine cohorts are held in import quarantine until 7 days from the last exposure to New World screwworm, i.e. the last visualization of live larvae in the affected equine. An APHIS VMO or authorized veterinarian under direct VS oversight will perform an exam, a New World screwworm exam, during the last 24 hours of the 7-day quarantine period. Again, this includes a full visual and physical examination. Equine genitalia is fully examined, is thoroughly inspected, same with mucous membranes. And again, sedation is required for stallions and geldings and may be necessary for mares. If no New World screwworm is detected, the cohorts are then eligible for release from import quarantine. Any cattle on the premises, some of our land border ports will actually, those premises, those quarantines will house both horses and cattle. So that's why this came up. Any cattle on the premises will not be eligible for import into the United States, and no new animals. It kicked ahead again. It's very sensitive. No new animals will be accepted into the quarantine facility until APHIS has confirmed cleaning and disinfection of the facilities. Speaking of which, after detection of New World screwworm in horses in an APHIS-approved import quarantine facility, all larvae expelled into the environment must be collected into tightly sealed tubes with alcohol to kill the larvae. The tubes should be placed in a sealable bag and disposed of as regulated garbage. All bedding and waste and refuse should be sprayed with insecticide prior to removal and promptly bagged. Prior to movement off-site or for disposal, the contents of the bag must be drenched. So you open up the bag, you give the bag a little shake to make sure nothing's buzzing around in there, to make sure that all the flies are dead, because you don't want to release them, of course. And then you open up the bag just enough to get the nozzle of your sprayer in there, and you thoroughly drench the inside of the bag. And then you close it up again tightly, and then that sprayed bag needs to be placed in a secondary bag, and the inside and outside of that secondary bag is then drenched in insecticide as well. And then all bags are disposed of as regulated garbage. The holding areas, so stocks, alleyways, stalls, etc. After all of this waste has been removed, as previously described, should be sprayed with a larvicidal insecticide and then wiped out to find any more potential larval or pupal flies. They should then be washed with warm water and soap to reduce animal exposure to insecticide residue. Facilities with dirt floors. This is mainly going to be occurring in our land border ports. We do not have any airport quarantine facilities that have dirt floors. Must remain fallow for 3 biological life cycles. That's about 90 days. And the rest of them, the facilities with concrete floors, will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis prior to receiving additional shipments of horses. Monitoring of the premises. Flypaper should be hung in several locations in the quarantine areas. This flypaper needs to be monitored weekly or more often, depending on how laden with flies they become. and also to make sure it doesn't dry out. So if you're in a particularly dry area, all flies found should be removed from the paper, gently teased off the paper to not destroy the fly. And the fly should then be put into a vial containing alcohol and sent to NVSL for identification. Continue this monitoring and submission of any flies at least weekly for 1 full month after the affected animals have been released. And APHIS must be notified of any additional findings of screwworm flies during this monitoring process. And I spoke really fast, but I think I hit it within my 20 minutes. So these are the resources. I will send this presentation to Katie so she can send it out so you actually have access to all of these resources. But here are all the resources that we have for importing horses from Mexico, and then a few other resources that we have on some of our New World Screwworm documentation and SOPs and guidance documents. So I will open it up. I think it's time for all New World Screwworm questions now. So I will open it up for that.
Thanks, Dr. McNitt. Yes, thanks for this presentation. Just so everyone's aware, I am pushing the last topic, which happens to be me, to next month. So we have about 10 minutes for additional questions. I do have some in the chat that I will start with, and I also have received some other ones myself. So Dr. McNitt, I believe this one's for you. Does a visible wound assumed to be open or unhealed? And I think this is on the 3 to 5 day prior inspection. If a wound is detected.
So visible, we're talking any visible wounds, open, closed, anything.
Okay.
We're not differentiating between those.
So those horses that have any type of wound cannot be in the shipment.
Correct.
And then if there is a wound detected at that 24-hour, those are to be treated before they can be shipped.
Yep.
Okay, and then healed wound, what is your definition? This is one I got afterwards. So what is your definition of a healed wound? Evidence of healing.
So that's no evidence. So we're talking that the skin has now come back together and there's no evidence of a break in the skin.
Okay.
If it makes sense.
Yep. Okay. There's a question about, will we be notified if there are cases detected at a quarantine facility?
So APHIS will notify our AVICs and our SAHOs of any detection of New World Screwworm in a quarantine facility within their state.
Will the industry be notified?
That I will have to check on for you because we do not have I don't know why my brain is not, the word's there, but I can't bring it. We don't have an SOP for that notification at this point in time. So I will check on that and get back to you on that one.
Okay, thank you. You showed us a chart of approved, I believe those were approved ivermectin products. Is that in your list of resources?
That is not in the list of resources, but again, you'll have it here. And those are not approved ivermectin products. Those are the approved topicals. Those are the EPA approved topicals. But what I can do is when I send this presentation to you, Katie, is I can actually grab you the most current document that we have that has basically the information that's on that slide. So you guys don't have to try to read it off of that slide.
Okay, does that also, the document that you'll send, will it have the approved ivermectin products that are allowed?
So right now what we're saying is that if it's an oral ivermectin product that is formulated and administered per the manufacturer, sorry, that word never comes out right, per the manufacturer's directions, that is considered an approved product. When we say an unapproved product, it's a non-ivermectin product or like the doramectin products and things like that. Those are not approved and those are a derogation. So those would have to be requested prior to administering and we would have to approve it at that point in time.
So as long as it's an approved, if it has a label for horses and it's an ivermectin product, that would be considered approved?
Yes.
Okay. You had a slide that said suspension of export if New World Scrum is identified, can you please clarify what that means if all trade of horses would be suspended?
Is this the slide you're asking about, Katie?
I believe that's what it's referring to. Yeah, I believe that's the question.
So it's all equine exports. I'm only referring to equine exports. I cannot confirm right now that would suspend cattle exports to the US, but that would be all equine exports from Mexico.
So just to clarify, if somebody falsifies or it is found to be a non-compliance in one situation, the entire shipments of horses from Mexico, all shipments, all exports from Mexico would stop.
At this point, yes.
All right. And then the question that has been put forth is, how have staff been trained at the import centers, specifically the air import centers, regarding screwworm detection? And I think they're referencing the staff that cares for the horses, not the veterinarians doing the inspection, the staff that cares for them.
So that I will have to follow up with you on as far as whether or not the care staff are trained in looking for New World screwworm. Are all horses in federal, either privately owned or federally owned, APHIS approved import quarantines are examined. So they do get a vet check every single day, every 24 hours that they are in there. So they do have a VMO eyes on them. I do not believe that we have trained our care staff, so like the folks that are cleaning the stalls and everything, in that. But I can follow up with you I can follow up with our port VMOs, our port VICs, and get you the final answer for that one.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions yes, those are all the questions I have for Dr. McNitt. Are there any other questions for Dr. McNitt before I transition back to Dr. Nelly, who has a question for her? I don't see any additional ones in the chat. No one has texted me, nor do I have an email. So I am going to say thank you, Dr. McNitt. Those are the questions that I have for you. If we have additional questions, I'm happy to forward those on. And when you do provide the presentation, I will forward it to our distribution group. So thank you for your time. And I'm going to transition to Dr. Nelly. We do have a question for you that's in the chat. Did you utilize an emergency CE to use the noromectin in the environment? How long did it take to get clearance from NEPA requirements?
So we actually used doramectin in the key deer, and it actually wasn't under the Florida Department of Ag's jurisdiction because of, they're endangered. It was actually U.S. Fish and Wildlife that did that portion of it. So I don't have all the specific details. I can tell you that from the time we were notified till the time that we started doing the treatment was just under a month. So if that helps with the time frame for getting clearance. I know that there was a lot of discussion about how it would impact the environment. We were doing these treatment centers in the National Key Deer Refuge, and I know that that refuge is also home to other endangered species, including other endangered insects. So I do remember there being discussions about how those would be impacted. But remember, we weren't spraying this in the environment. We were hand feeding the deer. We would inject the doramectin into pieces of donut or sweetbread and hand feed the deer that would come up to us, which was a pretty big portion of them because they're like pets in the keys. And the other method for the ones that were more shy was, I had a picture of it, but basically we would dip paint rollers in the doramectin infusion and then put them on this stall where feed would be in the bottom portion of the stall. So when the key deer would lean over, their neck would come into contact with the paint roller and get it applied topically that way. So, the treatment methods were thought out to minimize the environmental impact, but it was specifically under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So I don't have, all the details of it.
Thanks, Dr. Nelly. Again, I think your presentation was excellent in highlighting the concerns we have if screwworm were to get into the United States. And so I hope everybody understands the precautions we're taking and the import requirements are necessary to prevent such an incursion. And again, I want to highlight one of the points Dr. Nelly said about getting accredited veterinarians as well as our human doctors aware of screwworm and the concerns related and how to identify them. So I appreciate your time and effort on this presentation. It's great information for our horse industry to have to help protect itself. Any last comments or questions? Well, at this time, I want to thank Dr. Nelly and Dr. McNitt for their presentation today. And we will see everybody next month, March 13th. And I will be giving my presentation at that time on USEF's biosecurity requirements. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.